The humiliation that sparked the fire was not just an isolated moment of rudeness, it was a piercing reminder of how deeply rooted prejudice still hides in places where respect should be the foundation. Imagine a man who has climbed every step of the ladder through relentless hard work, intelligence, and determination. A man who had proven himself in boardrooms, closed million-dollar deals, and earned the admiration of colleagues and competitors alike. Yet, in this particular moment, none of that mattered. All they saw was his skin, all they considered was their narrow perception, and with a single act of arrogance, they tried to strip him of his worth. He walked into that environment expecting the same respect he had worked for his entire life, but instead, he was met with sneers, whispers, and gestures that cut deeper than words. The kind of humiliation that makes silence louder than noise, the kind that lingers long after the moment has passed. They thought they could diminish him with a look, with a dismissive gesture, with the quiet arrogance of those who believe power lies in exclusion. They thought they were mocking a man who didn't belong, someone who had wandered into a space that was not meant for him. But in reality, they were mocking their own ignorance, their own blindness to greatness standing before them. The CEO felt the sting of their actions, not because he doubted his own worth, but because he knew the weight of the disrespect was aimed not just at him but at every person who had ever been judged unfairly. This was not merely personal, it was symbolic, and the fire it lit within him was one that demanded more than anger. It demanded justice. The humiliation was public, and it carried with it the heavy sting of embarrassment. People watched, some in silence, some even joining in the mockery, reinforcing the cruelty of the moment. In that instant, he was not seen as a leader, not as a man of influence, but as someone who could be pushed aside, as though success had no value when draped in black skin. That sting is not one that fades easily. It festers, it burns, and it begins to shape itself into something sharper than rage. Because rage can be loud and impulsive, but humiliation has a way of settling deep into the heart, planting seeds of resolve. What they didn't realize was that by trying to make him small, they were instead awakening the very part of him that had always turned obstacles into stepping stones. The fire did not erupt in an outburst or in a scene of confrontation. No, his fire was different. It was quiet, controlled, deliberate. The humiliation became a mirror, showing him not his weakness but their fear, not his inadequacy but their pettiness. They had underestimated him in the worst possible way, and that underestimation would be their undoing. The fire inside him was not just about revenge, it was about restoring the balance, about proving with action that dignity cannot be stolen, that respect cannot be denied to someone who has earned it, and that arrogance always has a price. The moment of humiliation stretched in his memory, replaying with vivid clarity, not to torment him but to fuel him. Every dismissive glance, every cruel smirk, every word that carried the weight of bias added to the intensity of that fire. It became not just about reclaiming respect but about teaching a lesson that could not be ignored. The humiliation was their weapon, but it became his motivation. They thought they had taken something from him, but instead, they had given him the very spark he needed to craft a response so powerful that it would echo louder than their insult ever could. He remembered the sting, but he also remembered who he was. He was not a man defined by their narrow views, nor was he someone who had to beg for validation. His achievements, his position, his influence, all of it stood untouched by their attempt to diminish him. And yet, because of that moment, he now had a reason to act, a reason to transform their cruelty into a demonstration of brilliance. Humiliation has a strange power, it can crush those who allow it to define them, but it can also ignite those who choose to rise above it. For this CEO, it became the spark that would set everything in motion, the fire that would turn his quiet revenge into something unforgettable. Silent strength behind the CEO's calm exterior was the kind of power most people fail to recognize until it is too late. In the face of humiliation, many would have reacted with immediate anger, shouting back, demanding recognition, or creating a scene that only feeds the satisfaction of those who instigated the disrespect. But he understood something deeper. True strength is not always in the loud response, but in the silence that unsettles, the calm that unnerves, and the patience that builds power in the shadows. When they looked at him and thought he had been defeated by their arrogance, what they were really seeing was the surface of a man who knew exactly when to reveal the depth of his might. They mistook his quiet for weakness, his composed expression for surrender, but beneath it was the unshakable foundation of someone who had weathered storms far greater than a single act of disrespect. His calm was not passive, it was deliberate, a choice forged through years of experience. As a black man who had fought for his place in boardrooms, negotiations, and executive circles where his presence was often questioned, he had learned the art of restraint. Every insult, every doubting look, every underestimation had taught him that anger often gave power to the offender, but composure stripped them of their control. Silent strength became his greatest weapon, a shield that absorbed humiliation without allowing it to weaken him, and a blade that could cut deeper when the time for action arrived. When they smirked and believed they had triumphed, he let them think it, because he knew that revenge is not effective when it is rushed. Revenge is most powerful when it is calculated, precise, and delivered in a way that leaves no room for denial. Behind his calm exterior, thoughts were already moving with the precision of a master strategist. He was not dwelling on the sting of their disrespect but shaping the blueprint of a response that would not just equal the insult but surpass it. To the untrained eye, he looked like a man who had been put in his place, someone silently enduring the humiliation. But in truth, he was the one in control of the situation. By not reacting outwardly, he created a dangerous illusion, that they had won. And that illusion, when shattered, would amplify the brilliance of his revenge. Silent strength is not about suppressing emotion, it is about channeling it into action that speaks louder than words ever could. Every leader understands the value of patience, but great leaders know the value of timing. He knew that the moment he chose to act would determine the impact. A rash outburst would have made him just another victim of disrespect, but waiting, observing, and then executing a perfectly timed response would turn him into a symbol of dignity, intelligence, and unstoppable resolve. His silence was the ticking of a clock they could not hear, and each passing second brought him closer to the moment where the balance would shift. They thought his stillness was compliance, but it was the opposite, it was preparation. There is an unmistakable energy in people who carry silent strength. It radiates not in noise but in presence. Even those who disrespected him could not fully ignore the weight of his composure. Somewhere deep inside, they felt unsettled, though they couldn't name it. They expected anger, confrontation, or at least visible pain. What they got instead was stillness, and that stillness carried a warning they were too arrogant to recognize. Silent strength is often misread, but once revealed, it commands a level of respect that arrogance cannot withstand. The CEO embodied this perfectly. He let the insult wash over him, not because he accepted it, but because he understood the power of choosing the battlefield. Behind his calm exterior was not just strength but wisdom. He understood that the humiliation he faced was more than a personal attack, it was part of a larger pattern, a reflection of how society often undermines people who don't fit its narrow definitions of power and privilege. And so, his silence became more than personal discipline, it became a statement. It said, without words, I will not be dragged down to your level. I will not let your smallness dictate my greatness. I will respond, but not on your terms. This was the kind of strength that turns enemies into spectators and makes even the most arrogant pause when they finally realize the depth of what they are up against. He sat there, calm, composed, allowing the humiliation to linger in the air while beneath the surface he was building the moment that would come. Silent strength is deceptive because it looks like still water, but beneath it can flow currents strong enough to change entire landscapes. And that was exactly who he was in that moment, still on the outside, unstoppable on the inside. His silence was not a retreat, it was the tightening of a bowstring, waiting for the perfect release. Turning pain into power through strategy is the mark of someone who understands that every wound can be transformed into a weapon if the response is chosen wisely. Pain by itself can consume, it can distort judgment and drive reckless decisions. But when pain is held with discipline, when it is studied and molded, it becomes the most potent source of strength. The CEO knew this well. The humiliation he endured could have easily been a source of bitterness, an open wound festering with anger. Yet instead of letting it define him in weakness, he chose to refine it into a source of determination, a blueprint for action. His pain became the very fuel that would drive his strategy, and that strategy would become the brilliance of his revenge. He understood that power is not only about having influence, wealth, or authority, it is about knowing how to use circumstances to shift the balance in your favor. Pain gave him clarity, forcing him to focus on what truly mattered, stripping away distractions and pushing him to think beyond the immediate moment. Rather than striking back in anger, he let the sting of humiliation sharpen his resolve. Every slight, every dismissive glance, every degrading word became data, carefully stored in his memory, not to torment him but to serve as pieces of the puzzle he would later put together. Strategy thrives on awareness, and pain heightened his awareness to a level where nothing escaped his notice. The CEO knew that reacting emotionally would only play into the hands of those who disrespected him. They expected outrage, they expected him to confirm their prejudice by lashing out. Instead, he took the opposite path. He studied them, their arrogance, their assumptions, and their vulnerabilities. Pain gave him the patience to wait, and waiting gave him the ability to design a plan that would not just answer their insult but dismantle the very foundation of their confidence. He did not allow humiliation to dictate his moves, he allowed it to guide his preparation. In this way, the pain of being underestimated became the silent architect of his strategy. Every great strategist knows that the best revenge is not about destruction but about demonstration. The CEO chose to turn the humiliation into an opportunity, a stage on which he would showcase the brilliance of his mind and the strength of his character. Instead of lowering himself to the level of those who disrespected him, he decided to elevate the entire situation by proving his worth in a way that could not be denied. This was not about shouting louder or demanding recognition, it was about creating a moment so undeniable that even his critics would be forced to acknowledge the truth they had ignored. Pain gave him the fire, but strategy gave him the direction, and together they formed a response far greater than anything anger could achieve. Turning pain into power required him to control the narrative. In situations of humiliation, the offender often believes they control the story, that their actions will define how the victim is perceived. But the CEO knew better. He understood that perception can be reshaped, that narratives can be rewritten, and that the best way to seize control is through action that contradicts expectation. His pain pushed him to think not of retaliation in the heat of the moment but of the long game, where every move would be calculated to maximize impact. By channeling his hurt into strategy, he ensured that when the moment came, his response would not just sting, it would transform the entire conversation. Pain also reminded him of the responsibility he carried. He was not just a man enduring humiliation, he was a symbol of resilience, of leadership, of breaking barriers. His strategy was not only about himself but about everyone who had ever been judged unfairly. The sting of humiliation made him realize that his revenge had to be bigger than personal satisfaction. It had to send a message. It had to show that strength is not in loud retaliation but in the ability to take pain and turn it into an undeniable victory. His plan became bigger than a response, it became a testament. Strategy, in its truest sense, is about timing, resources, and precision. Pain gave him the motivation to act, but it also gave him the discipline to wait until everything aligned. He knew that a rushed reaction would be forgotten, but a perfectly executed response would be remembered forever. Pain slowed him down, not in weakness but in wisdom. It taught him to hold back, to measure every detail, and to prepare for a moment that would not just address the insult but leave a permanent mark on those who had tried to belittle him. And so, with every passing day, the pain of humiliation became less of a burden and more of a blueprint. It fueled his late nights of planning, his careful decisions, his unwavering focus. Pain, when unchecked, is chaos. But when mastered, it becomes a weapon more powerful than rage. The CEO mastered it. He harnessed it. He transformed it into the foundation of a strategy that would redefine not only how they saw him but how they would forever see themselves in the aftermath of his revenge. The moment of brilliant revenge unveiled itself not in a loud spectacle, but in a calculated act of precision that shifted the entire balance of power. For days, weeks, perhaps even longer, the CEO carried the sting of humiliation deep within him, but not as a burden that weakened his spirit. It became the very core of his planning, the silent motivator that guided every thought and every move he prepared. When the moment finally came, it was not rushed, it was not impulsive, it was executed with the kind of elegance that only someone with discipline and vision could achieve. Those who had laughed, those who had dismissed him, those who believed they had put him in his place, suddenly found themselves standing in the shadow of a man they could no longer ignore. His revenge was not about raising his voice, it was about raising the stakes, and in doing so he revealed the brilliance of his mind and the undeniable force of his presence. The brilliance of his revenge was in its subtlety. He didn't need to humiliate them with the same cruelty they had used against him, because real power doesn't mimic weakness. Instead, he chose to expose them through success, through influence, through undeniable authority. The very people who thought they had silenced him suddenly realized they were the ones silenced by the weight of his response. The tables had turned in such a way that there was no room for argument, no room for justification. He had orchestrated an outcome that left them staring at the consequences of their arrogance. The quiet dignity he carried during his humiliation had now transformed into an unshakable triumph, and that transformation was his revenge. What made it brilliant was that it struck exactly where it hurt the most, at their pride. Humiliation thrives on making someone feel small, but his revenge flipped the scale, making them the ones who appeared insignificant. It was not through anger or confrontation, but through a demonstration so powerful that it stripped away their false superiority. They had tried to reduce him to nothing more than a target of mockery, yet here he stood, not only reclaiming his respect but magnifying it to a level that left them exposed. Brilliance in revenge is not about matching cruelty with cruelty, it is about using intelligence to create an outcome that resonates long after the moment has passed. He did not need to explain himself, because the results of his actions spoke louder than any words could.